Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome to High Strangeness. I'm Tony, and this is a place where we talk about all things strange and unexpected in our reality. We are now in October, which is Halloween time. And for so many people and families, this is a very fun time of the year. For people, families, and so on, they are building memories, and for others, they're reminiscing cool experiences of their past. Now, in October, many people binge watch movies and shows that give you that, well, Halloween feel. Some movies like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow take you back in time, where there are horses, wagons, and before technology was around. Then there's other fun and whimsical movies like Hocus Pocus that are centered around witches and that point you back to real events that happened, like the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials is a bit of history that many people are aware of, but the details and facts are not well understood. So because of that, there are details in that history that are unknown to many. It's a perfect topic for this show. And so that's why I'm so excited to have an expert who is also an author on the show today to help us understand more about Salem, the community around it, and the social climate of that time period. My guest today works as a freelance writer, illustrator, researcher, and presenter of talks on historical subjects. She has written publications as varied as Boston Globe, the New England Historic Genealogical Register, and the Lizzie Borden Quarterly. She is a member of the Gallows Hill Project that verified the correct site of the 1692 hangings, a discovery that is listed in Archaeology Magazine's list of the world's 10 most important discoveries of 2017. She's also an author of 2 Salem witch trial books that will be part of our discussion today. And her name is Marilyn Roach. And I'm excited to have her on the call today and on the show. And so we're going to learn a lot from her. So I want to welcome you, Marilyn. Thank you so much for being on the show. How are you doing today?
Fine, thanks. And thanks for inviting me.
That's great. I appreciate it. And you are coming to us today from New England. Is that correct?
Yep, Massachusetts, within a commuter rail distance of Salem.
Wonderful. And we're talking at the very end of the summer. It's actually the beginning of September. How has the weather been there this summer? Has it been pretty hot and humid up there?
Oh, it was unbearably humid and hot. Knock wood, it's cooled off a lot. Today was beautiful all around. And at least the nights are cool for sleeping. So you don't get worn out just existing in a tropical.
Yeah. I actually was on the East Coast for about 3 weeks this summer, and it was, to be honest, unbearable. It was so hot and so humid. I had forgotten how that feels, because currently I live in Utah, where it's a dry heat. But being back there for a little bit, it got pretty humid. My glasses kept fogging up, all that stuff. So I'm glad it's starting to cool down for you guys. Well, as we get started, one of the things I like to do at the start of interviews is to just find out a little bit about the author. I think that's fun for me, and it's fun for the listeners to learn a little bit about the author and how you became a researcher and author and how you became interested in the witch trials. Would you share some of that with us today?
Sure. Well, I've always loved reading. History was always interesting. I went to art school, Massachusetts College of Art, class of 68, to become an illustrator, and I do that too. But my historical training would be reading everything I could get my hands on in the public library, and then graduating to archives, manuscript, the real stuff, the actual sources themselves. But the witch trials was something that was always interesting because of the spooky references to it, of course. but I kept coming back to it. There were only a few books at that time available about them. Now there's a whole lot, and with good scholarship showing up. But I get one out from the library now and then and read up on it, and it would be interesting, and then I'd go on to something else. In, well, 50 years ago, during the bicentennial of the American Revolution, 1975, I got a guidebook that the city of Salem put out showing everything that was in the city, not just the witch trial stuff. But I decided I'd go up there after reading one of the regular books that I could get from the library. I'd go up and see it for myself, and it was a perfect spring day. That just, the city was beautiful. The wisteria was blooming on the Federalist era houses. It was just lovely. And I went to see certain spots that I was interested in, like the so-called witch house, which is where one of the judges, Colin, lived, an actual site where things happened. The Essex Institute and the Salem Witch Museum and the House of Seven Gables were high on my list. So I saw these things, and some of what I was told in some of the places, they have become much more historically oriented now as more information turns up. Didn't quite agree with what I had just read, and of course what I had just read wasn't as accurate as a lot of books coming out now, so it's a learning process for a lot of people. But I thought at that time, as I was heading for the House of Seven Gables across the common in the middle of Salem, that maybe there was a book in this that I could do, because I was writing picture books at the time. It took 27 years and a couple of dozen rejection slips, but finally a book came out, My Salem Witch Trials Day-by-Day Chronicle. If I'd known it was going to take that long, I think I would have been too discouraged to try, so ignorance helps a lot in some things. But I did. The only way I could keep track of all the information I was finding was to put it in chronological order, which is how the book is arranged chronologically, because there's just so much stuff in it. In fact, I'd written the whole thing, and then I decided, in my vast ignorance, there was one thing I didn't know. That's laughable right there. But I didn't know the name of Hangman. So the Massachusetts Archives had just moved into a new location that was archivally the way it should be. It had moved from the basement of the State House into this new place. And I went out there to see this one piece, I thought, of information I didn't know, and there were shelves of books and reels of microfilm that I hadn't known was existed. So I had based my first version of the book on what was already in print. But now I was looking at some things that were not in print, but I proceeded to just read everything I could find on microfilm, which is hard on the eyes, but it was worth it, on the period that was under discussion. And I found out, for example, that there was a war going on the whole time, that the witch trials wasn't something that happened in a vacuum. So that, fortunately, I'd found that source. And the book that was finally the result of all that was much better than it would have been without that information. But I still do not know the name of the hangman. I guess what you find on bills that weren't paid right away, there's copies of them in there. I guess he got paid up front. But maybe someday I'll find out.
Yeah.
So that was how that first book came out. But the information is, while I was doing this and time was marching on for the 27 years, John Demos's book, Entertaining Satan, which was a sociological study, came out, and the Boyer and Nussbaum sociological study came out, and all of a sudden it was respectable to research the Salem witch trials again. It wasn't just a spooky thing that you were doing because you liked Halloween, which I do, but it didn't seem enough reason. In fact, when I was doing research at the Essex Institute in Salem, they asked, what's your topic of interest that you plan to publish on, and so forth. And I wrote down my topic was local history, which it was, but I was felt a little funny about saying the Salem witch trials. I got over that well and truly, but a lot of really good research by PhDs was coming out, so this was a respectable subject to look into. And although I don't have a doctorate by any means, but I did back up everything with footnotes and endnotes, and people who are professors and so forth approve of the way I did it. So knowing how to do a good footnote and where to look is invaluable. I learned a lot from looking at other people's footnotes and bibliography. And new stuff keeps turning up all the time. Little bits, but well, I'd love a cache of manuscripts, of course, but sometimes just little pieces of information will fit into something else that you've seen somewhere, and it puts a whole new light on certain events, which is very exciting when it happens.
Yeah. Well, I think that's amazing that you spent the time to, like you said, maybe in the beginning you didn't realize it was going to take that much time, but you spent time gathering that information and being thorough. And that's what you were saying, is it's respectable to all people, PhD or not, that the work you did was quality work. That's amazing. That's awesome.
Well, I tried. Well, I put so much time into it that I didn't want to throw it away by stopping, but it was pretty discouraging at times, and then it began to work out.
Yeah.
Stubborn.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I appreciate you sharing that with us. And I think that makes the book for people even more exciting to read it, because the level of work and time put into it is a treasure right there in itself. So thank you for doing that.
Well, it also helped that it took so long for it to see print. It took so long for it to see print that Massachusetts exonerated 5 more suspects, and I ended the book on that, not knowing that there was one that had been left out, but has since been exonerated. So I think we've got them all now from 1692.
Yeah. That's funny. Okay, so as we get going here, I would like to start with asking you just some basic questions about Salem and that time period, and the culture of the time, and just kind of what led to everything. So I'm going to start with some real basic questions first, and we'll just see where it goes, and pull us into your book throughout this conversation anytime you want. So the first thing this is not necessarily a Salem witch trial question, but it is a question I have, and maybe you know the answer. I was wondering, we have witches, and then there's something called Wiccan. Is Wiccan the religion of witches? I don't really know what that is. Do you know?
Yes, witch as a word covers several things that they're not all the same. It depends who's talking and what they mean. Wiccans are a present day neo-pagan, if I'm describing it right, religion that's sort of nature-based, and as far as I know, and all that, from being an outsider. But that's not what people in 1692 were being accused of. And witches back then weren't fairy tale characters either. It was assumed, and the way the laws were written, it was assumed that a witch was someone a mortal person, who purposely allied with the devil, with the forces of evil, in order to get back at their neighbors, or just to be mean, or to spread evil in the world, the opposite of good. That's not what the suspects were actually doing. Some of them were bad neighbors, some of them were cranky, some of them were not. And in 92, the panic was so bad that anybody could be suspected. But no, they were not Wiccans back then. And they weren't actually witches either, which is the
Yeah.
tragedy.
So as we look at that a little bit today, because that's what I understand. It was a scary time for just probably everybody because of the way these accusations came out. I'm curious, could you speak a moment about the environment, the social or political climate of the time there in Salem, um, and how that may have aided in this hysteria coming about?
Right. Well, it was not a peaceful time because, let's see, Massachusetts had lost its charter. England didn't like the way things were going. There was really too much independent activity going on in the colony. Uh, Not to mention the fact that the Quakers had been persecuted. We're complaining about that. That had stopped by then. But uh, Massachusetts needed to shape up, but they didn't need all of their self-government taken away, which is pretty much what happened. A royal governor was sent over, and he was going to rule with his chosen council, whom he really didn't listen to too much. And that did not sit well with people. And the fact that deeds and such like were considered null and void unless the royal governor approved of it. So there was a lot of really uncertainty. And when there was a revolution in England, when a new set of monarchs came in, there was a local uprising, which was a prelude to the actual War of Independence, in which they took the royal governor and his staff in custody and eventually shipped him off to England. It was all very rousing at the time, but then what do you do with him? And are we sure that England's going to agree with us? So, meantime, there's negotiations going on in England with a representative from Massachusetts for an increased matter to get a new charter so that we could rule ourselves, at least to some extent. That actually happened in late 1691. But the charter itself and what was the details in it did not come over to Massachusetts until May of 1692, at which point, with a new governor, royally appointed but a local New Englander, who arrived to find the jails full of witch suspects, or suspects who were assumed to be witches. But at the same time, England and France are contending for the New World territories. And French Canada, with their native allies who have their own reasons to be upset with the English encroachments on their territory, there's raids and attacks and fighting, and the New England states, mostly Massachusetts, sends out militia to counteract that. There was a big expedition that was, I believe, suggested by New York, where New York, Connecticut would send a force up the Hudson River to Montreal, and New England ships would go up and around and down the St. Lawrence River and attack Quebec. But the smallpox, lack of contact with each other, they're not tweeting orders to each other. It takes a while to get in contact with the other side to know what even they're doing. And there were delays sailing, and then the weather was full of storms, and smallpox breaks out on the ship, so that the Massachusetts forces do get to Quebec, but they do not succeed in conquering Canada, for one thing, obviously. But they exchange some captives. They sail home into a terrible storm. Ships sink. Archaeologists found one a couple of decades ago. And all of this is costing money, of course, and the Treasury's not in good shape. They're still vulnerable to northern attacks. Then you never know when this is going to happen. None of this is doing the economy any good. There's privateers, French privateers, preying on New England fishing and the coastal trade. There's New England privateers doing what they can against French shipping too, but it's not helping in Massachusetts. And there's regular pirates. There was a particular case where somebody decides they'll just take off on their own, and they go up the coast and they go down as far as Virginia, and then they come back and get caught. And there was a trial about that. And a couple of them were hanged, but most of them were exonerated one way or another because they knew somebody, and that left a bad taste in some of the locals' minds because they had things stolen from them. So there's pirates. The economy's bad. You don't know if you're going to be able to vote or own your own farm or not. Naturally, the indigenous Wabanaki Confederacy is attacking because they'd like some of their land back. And it's very unsettled. So in Salem and Salem Village, local conflicts are going on in addition to all this. And Salem Village, which is where the panic started, was part of Salem. It's the rural end of town. Really, they're out in the sticks, according to the richer merchants down by the harbor. There's a number of people in the village would like to separate, be their own town, because it's a long way to walk into downtown Salem. They've got, at this point, they have their own church, their own meeting house, so that they don't have to leave the farm and walk 7 miles to get to a meeting. But still, they're part of Salem. They're paying taxes, and they don't feel that they're really being listened to by the Salem selectmen when it comes to things that would benefit them. And the downtown Salem part by the harbor is mostly the merchants and the maritime trades that support all the ships, ropes, supplies, tar, and so forth. So there's that, but not everyone in the village wants to separate either. So there's that conflict at home. And there's local personal conflicts of neighbors with neighbors. And they have, as I say, their own church as opposed to the congregation, not opposed, but separate from the congregation in the middle of town. They have a minister. They've had 4 ministers, one after the other, but not a permanent one until 1689 when they ordained, because this is going to be their pastor for the rest of his life into the future. Everybody's getting along. Well, they're not getting along because after a while, not too long after he is installed, a number of people in the congregation decide they really would like somebody else, and they don't like the contract that they have made, or a committee has made with him. Does he or does he not own the parsonage which the town had built? And you know, if there's going to be a string of ministers, you want somewhere to house them. But presumably he was going to stay forever until it was the controversy. So does he or does he not own the house? Are they going to pay for his firewood or not? There is a contract, but it sounds as if the committee that made the decision, and then there's another committee that's elected in another year, and they disagree with it. So there's a lot of personality conflict that you can sort of see in the trial papers, because people are talking. You get to know something of how they sound. But there was plenty of personality conflicts that we don't know. That it would be fascinating to be a fly on the wall, to go to some of those town meetings, village meetings, and see just who's arguing about what. So there's that. And there'd be a lot of tension inside the parsonage because the family is, do we get to stay or not? And at the end of January in 1692, there's a terrific attack in South Maine. York, Maine is burned. People are taken hostages and marched towards Canada to be ransomed or not. And that's getting closer and closer to Massachusetts because there's only a little coastline to New Hampshire, and then it's Massachusetts. So I think that struck fear into the hearts of a lot of people. because most of the attacks had been to the north in Maine coast, New Hampshire, and a lot of people had been burned out, and they came south. A lot of people were in Salem. They had relatives here, or because it was the second largest urban environment in Massachusetts, and a lot had gone to Boston, the capital, which is the biggest settlement. So they know what's going on up north, and they don't know what's going to happen next. So with all that and the personal conflicts, at the around the time of the York attack, because having things chronological really helped see this, is about the time when two girls in the minister's family, Reverend Samuel Parris, his 9-year-old daughter Betty, and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, start acting strangely. I don't really have an answer for this, but there maybe some of it was a game, maybe not. They're crawling under the furniture and making odd noises, but they also suffer headaches and they just feel bad. And so the family, throughout February, contacts one physician after another. There's not a lot of them in the area, and the doctoring has not as much studied then as it does now. But there were a number around, and some would have, not itinerant exactly, they'd have a circuit of traveling, just because not everybody in town gets sick often enough to support a doctor. But they couldn't figure out what was going on with them. But the most local doctor, who was really new in the village, diagnosed, in his opinion, they must be under an evil hand, which is a saying meaning they're under a curse. There's some evil magic directed at them. Well, who's doing that? They want to know, but the family doesn't do anything right away about sending out the sheriff or something. But no doubt, if they're not asking leading questions, the houses aren't that big. The kids are hearing the parents worrying about them, discussing it with someone else. And I assume they believe it, at least at the beginning. And there's these two girls, but soon enough, there are at least two others who live several miles away to the east and another one several miles away to the west. So they might meet each other once a week in the Sabbath meetings, but they're not all in the same room at the same time plotting the way some of the stories go. The geography doesn't work out. But the others are having fits and conniptions and they're convulsing too. One of the older girls to the east lives with the doctor. She's his niece, and the other is the daughter of Thomas Putnam, who's on committees, and he's not the leader in the town, but he might like to be. But they are, the parents, I'm sure, are really worried about them. But how much of it was playing them, or how much do they feel they need to continue with it, and how much have they really scared themselves into thinking that if parents and the doctor are saying it could be witchcraft, maybe it really is. I think they would believe that it probably was. So eventually they come up with names, the usual suspects. Sarah Good, who's been reduced to begging. Sarah Osborne, who's a sickly woman, but there's a property dispute between her second husband and his grown stepsons, as to when they're going to get their father's farm back. And the enslaved woman in the parsonage, Tituba, who's always spoken of as an Indian, presumably from the Caribbean. They're kind of the usual suspects because, A, they're women. They're marginalized one way or the other. But by the time this is over, anybody could have been suspected, because the two richest people in Salem are arrested. Men are arrested, church members, the beggar woman, people with dicey reputations, or the farmer who's always getting into fist fights, and perfectly respectable people by everybody, by their neighbors' definition. So it did flare out of hand rather quickly, but it's a leap.
I was going to ask you, with this, these young girls and young women feeling afflicted, what's the time period between when it starts to when they start making accusations? Is that a short period of time, or does it go on for a while before they start pointing at people?
Yeah, about a month, I would say, because the York attack was at the end of January, and it seemed to start right after that. So the end of January to the end of February, and then on February 29th, a number of adults go into Salem and make out a complaint to the magistrates that this witchcraft involved. So it's about a month. So the first hearing is on March 1st, and it's going to be held at the local ordinary, which is a tavern in Salem Village, because one of the deals about getting a liquor license is that you have to allow the premises be used for certain public meetings like hearings, which is what they were going to do. But so many people show up that they move the proceedings to the nearby meeting house, which is an all-purpose building for like selectmen meetings, the occasional hearing, as well as the religious services on Sabbath. So people are, standing room only. They're looking in through the windows. And two magistrates come out from Salem town. Salem Village is now Danvers and Middleton, which is finally did separate from Salem, but it's a long walk. In fact, I was in Danvers the first time I went. The bus back to the Salem Railroad station just didn't come, so I walked. It took me a while. And in those days, you didn't have to contend with a lot of traffic, but there weren't a lot of bridges and pavement either. So it's a distance.
Wow.
So they come out there, and everybody wants to see what's happening. I guess they're not out in the fields planting yet, so they have the opportunity. And the three women are questioned one after another. The first two deny it. Sarah Good says, well, maybe the other two are guilty, but I'm not. Sarah Osborne says she's more likely to be a victim than to be a witch. And Tituba is, well, she has no standing being enslaved, but the questioning is aggressive anyway. It would be for any suspected crime, to judge from what little dialogue I've found in the records from other things like theft. But it's not so much as, did you do it? It's so much, why did you do it? They start out asking. So she's bullied, in effect, into confessing. She says she's innocent. She says she did not do it. She loves the girl. She would not do this to Betty. And she's innocent. And then the story kind of evolves. She's saying the witches who were hurting the girls, whoever they were, threatened her too. They threatened to cut her head off. They threatened to kill her if she did not join them. And so that's taken as a confession right there that she's joined them. So she's not in a good place, but she says that there were other witches. Yeah, the other two that you arrested, but there were others out there. There's 9 in all. I don't know who they were. I never saw them before, but some of them live in Boston, and I didn't do it. And then finally, because the questions do not stop, they've made me blind now. I can't see the invisible world anymore, and that ended it for that day. And people go home thinking not that they caught the culprit so much as who else is out there. And for a couple of weeks, I guess people were thinking, well, who else is out there? Who do I not trust? Who would be the neighbor who I don't like? I wouldn't put it past them to be doing this. And
Hmm.
the suspicions escalate from there, and spread too geographically,
Wow.
because Salem Village and then Salem Town and around the edges of adjacent towns. But in the middle of summer, the suspicions went to Andover, a more prosperous place than Salem Village, somewhat to the north, and more people were accused in Andover than there were in Salem. And by that point, people were confessing, as Tituba did. They get backed into doing it because they're so confused from what they said afterwards. They were so confused and frightened, they didn't know what they were saying. And the most that they could remember is that they probably just agreed with whatever people were accusing them of at the time. But they take it back now.
Wow.
Not that the court was taking it
Yeah.
back, but they made statements. And just a couple of stats there. I mean, before the Salem outbreak, there were about 120 people in all of New England that had been suspected. But in 1692, there are at least, I found, at least 191 people at least named as suspects.
Wow.
And 164
Wow.
of them, there's some kind of existing legal paper doing it. So the courts were clogged. They can't really try anyone yet because they don't have a new charter to make that legal. But so the jails keep filling up. I mean, Rebecca Nurse, a very respected woman, with a very supportive family too. Poor Sarah Good, her husband, said, "Did you see the witch mark when you were searching her?" He was no help at all. But Rebecca Nurse's family, they stuck by her to the end and beyond. But and beyond, yes. They even got petitions, statements from neighbors. People signed petitions in that year. There were 250 people who at least put their names to documents that they did to do that, or spoke, or
Wow.
volunteered to speak if they. But up to
Wow.
the point until the charter arrived, it's just hearings, and the jails are clogged. There's 4 jails in 3 counties people are in at this point, and they're not built
Wow.
to hold a lot of people, but they are holding a lot of people, and they're not intended to hold people for a long time. But there's this month-long wait from, say, the beginning of March into the end of May. But when the charter arrives, the new governor institutes a temporary court, which you can do. The court of oyer and termine, meaning to hear and to determine. It's a temporary court. It's not like a superior court. It's temporary to handle emergencies. And this was an emergency. And there's 9 judges on it. They need 5 for a quorum. And instead of sitting in Boston, which all capital cases were tried in Boston originally, because that's the capital, and the legislature would be the court. This court would convene in Salem because just all the people involved were up that way. Salem is the county seat, but there's people from the surrounding towns involved. And the trials
Marilyn,
began in June.
this is great. I have a question though.
What?
All these people that are now being accused, was there anything specifically, like any signs that they use to say, yes, this person's a witch, or was it just verbal accusations?
When somebody was arrested, some of the documents where they say so and so is in custody, The marshal or the constable would say that they had searched the premises where they lived to see if there were poppets, which are, like a voodoo doll type thing, to see if there were images that they'd been sticking pins into or something. And, well, darn it, they couldn't find any in a couple of cases because there weren't any. And sometimes somebody would find something, or one of the suspects who was ready to confess would have something in her pocket that she'd present, yeah, I must have been doing it with this, and it would be a piece of cloth wrapped up, or it wasn't really a poppet, but you want a poppet, here's a poppet for evidence that they were using something. But mostly it was the reaction of the supposed bewitched, and it's not just a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, it's mostly 18 to early 20s. Not the same people each time. There were about 70 different people who were considered afflicted in the course of the year. They didn't all testify in court. They might have something that they thought was bewitching them, but they weren't necessarily in court. And it was a different cast of characters for the most part. Some of the accusing parties stayed the course, but it was their reactions in the presence of the accused. They would, as if the supposed witch was casting evil at them that would hurt them, and they'd flinch away. They said they'd feel stabbed, and they'd fall on the floor and convulse. And I don't know, extreme fear maybe caused something. One problem with the afflicted who were having convulsions and so forth was that if they calmed down and rethought things and thought, it's not really what I thought it was, I was mistaken. And one girl who said that, it did not go well, because one thing that the supposed witch spirits, which only the bewitched could see, was saying is, if you don't join us, we'll hurt you, and we'll keep hurting you until you join us. So if somebody stopped hurting, did that mean they had just joined Satan's side? And so Mary Warren, she said she was mistaken, she was accused, and then she's being questioned a hearing, and the dialogue is fairly complete of the questions and answers, and she's just totally terrified. She's gibbering with fear. She can't really answer, and she has a convulsion, I think, too, because she's so darn scared. But she eventually agrees, yeah, I must have sold out to Satan, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And she went along with whatever the court thought was happening. She would say, yes, so-and-so is hurting me, and she's going along with it. So it wasn't easy to get out of it, even if you thought it was real in the first place. But that by definition is spectral evidence, because they may be convulsing, but what's causing it? They may think, assuming they're honest, they may think there's a witch coming at them, the specter, which is like a ghost, only that they're still alive, coming at them and doing things to them. But nobody else can see it, and only the other bewitched people can see it. There's also the disagreement among the experts as to whether a witch needed to give permission for this specter to be used. Now, theologically at the time, it was considered impossible for somebody's soul to depart from their body without dying and act against someone and then go back into the body. If somebody experienced something like that happening to them, obviously it was a devil, a minor demon, taking the appearance of the suspect and hurting somebody. But did you need to give your permission to it or not? And unfortunately, the chief judge and a few other people thought that it was necessary to give your permission, otherwise they couldn't do it. Whereas most of the ministers were arguing no, the devil's not going to ask your permission for anything, so you cannot trust the source of the information, which seemed obvious at the end of this, but not at the beginning, and a few people never did change their mind about it. But that's spectral evidence, and it should not have been used. And the excuse of the Oyer and Terminator judges was there was that, but there was also other evidence, which I suppose was the accounts by neighbors who were not having convulsions about arguments with the suspect in the past, after which dire things happened, like the cow died, or the baby died, or this, that, and the other happened. But once again, cause and effect can't really be proven, and that's pretty flimsy evidence, but it wasn't quite the spectral evidence, so at the time it must have been very frightening in court if you thought it was possible that it could be happening like that, which most people did think it was possible. But so the fact that other evidence, and I'm using air quotes here, was in the mix, seemed to make it okay, according to the judges who wanted to believe that. But later, at least one of them, Samuel Sewell, did admit publicly that he had been very wrong about all of that. Others didn't specifically make a statement like that, but there was a public fast in 1697 where the public at large had a public fast is the opposite of Thanksgiving. You're having a service where it's a group apology to the community and to God, saying that you've done something wrong. In this case, it was the witch trials. And just sitting through that and not objecting to it was most people's apology, in fact. But it got worse and worse all summer. The first trial, conviction, and hanging was a usual suspect, a woman who was suspected before, Bridget Bishop, and she was not a witch, but the evidence at the time seemed to point to it. She's the first that's hanged. And then there's a pause, because the people must have been having second thoughts. And the court, in fact, asked the Boston area ministers their advice, which was not to use spectral evidence, but we assume that because most people in Boston had not been attending the trials in Salem, they assumed that the judges knew what they were doing, that it wasn't just spectral evidence. We're taking your word on it here. So, go after the real witches, but don't go against the innocent. Unfortunately, they didn't seem to change their ways after that, and more people were accused, arrested, and so forth. There was the one person in June, 5 people in July were hanged, and in August, 5 more. And then, meanwhile, now Andover people are confessing en masse practically. And in September, there are 8 people hanged at once. But by then, besides the fact that it's escalated so at that point, by then, more people are doubting that the court is really on the right track. My mother gets accused, I know you're on the wrong track. If I'm accused, I'm really convinced you're on the wrong track. But there were protests, and of course there were at least 4 petitions about neighbors being innocent people, good Christians, great neighbors, and so on. At least 4 of those survive in the paperwork, and there's a lot of paperwork, but not everything survived. That people are beginning to pull back and objecting to the court's proceedings. So at the end of the next, let's see, the judges have gone up to Salem periodically, but Most of them live in Boston. Some of them live in Salem. In October, which is the busy month in Salem now with the tourists and Halloween, was the quiet month in 1692. People were reconsidering things. Now, not everybody thought they should stop, but more people did. And the weather, I assume, is getting cooler too, because it was not as hot most days as it is now. But the next sitting of the court was supposed to be November 1st, and it's canceled at the last minute. Postpone it. The Court of Oyer and Terminaire is dissolved. We're going to set this aside until we get advice from England. The governor's written to England. So this goes on hold. The legislators, the judges are also legislators, go to the task of re-examining the laws of Massachusetts as required by the charter to make sure it doesn't disagree with English law. So they're doing that. And meanwhile, they're waiting to hear from England, and the jails, however, are still full of people, and that it's not healthy. People are dying from natural causes. It's winter, it's cold, and by January, they figure they can't wait to hear from England because it's a long voyage over, and then it's got to go through political channels to get an answer and then come back. So the reconstructed government, they form a regular superior court, same one we have now, different cast of characters, a regular superior court that would sit at certain times of the year for the different counties. So in January, the court sits in Salem for Essex County. It's a smaller court. There's not as many judges, so not the same cast of characters, but most of them are the same people. This time, they're definitely not supposed to use spectral evidence. Absolutely not. Do not use spectral evidence. And more people are tried in this January. The grand juries, because there's due process all along, even the summer before. The grand jury dismisses most of the cases. More people are tried than had been in the summer, and only 3 are found guilty. The King's Attorney, which is like the Attorney General, says that in his opinion, the 3 that have been found guilty were found guilty on what amounts to spectral evidence. It wasn't any better than what was used the summer before. So this travels around as news. But the next hangings would have been on the 1st of February. And the Chief Justice, who's the same guy, signs the death warrant for a number of people who had been condemned before, plus the 3. But they hadn't hanged them yet because there were so many. And they would have hanged, I think, in February, except that the governor, at the last minute, sends a message to Salem and says, hold off until we hear from England, which they haven't heard from yet. So at the last minute, they're not hanged.
Wow.
The detention must have been awful, but they're not. And finally, well, they have some more trials in Suffolk County for Boston in April. Some more Essex. Trials for Middlesex County in the 1st of February. They start, and the Chief Justice hears about this. That the hangings have been called off without consulting him, without even telling him about it. So he's not pleased with that. He storms off the bench. So the second in command runs those trials. And there was some very suspicious stuff in one. They sort of scolded one of the suspects, but nobody's found guilty. Unfortunately, that woman who got off died in jail of natural causes before she could pay her jail fees and go home. But there's a few cases in April for Suffolk County in Boston. Nobody appears against this person. That's dismissed. And then in May, the last of the cases for Essex County when the court sits in Ipswich, including Tituba, who is found not guilty. And that's the end of the trial. There are people who need to pay their jail fees to get out, but most of them are let out. And England's advice arrives in July, and they say do your best. So the government would like to get on with everything else that's going wrong and put this behind us now. But of course, the families are shattered in some cases, and they've had to pay jail fees and taking a day off from the farm to go visit mother and bring her some clean clothes and food and so on. So this expenses and a lot of hard feeling. But as I said, in 1697, there is the group apology. By 1702, three of the women, one of the women who had been condemned but not hanged because she was lucky enough to survive this, petitions to have her name cleared, because what if this revives in the future? Her name is mud, and she could theoretically be hanged at any time. So it takes a while, but in a couple of years, she and two others who petition are cleared by name. But in 1711, because more people are petitioning, the reversal of attainder is signed by the then governor, which clears the names of a whole bunch of people at once, saying that their names are clear, the sentences are overturned. You're not to think of them as being guilty. And that's how it was until in the 1950s. The descendants of one of the women who was hanged petitioned to have the government, as 1950, clear her name, and they mostly deplored what their predecessors had done. But in 2001, just before my book was finished, Massachusetts cleared 5 more names that had been left out. The acting governor signed the bill on Halloween, which was really not appropriate considering, because the seriousness of it I don't think was fully brought home to them. But they were cleared by name. Some of them had been sort of cleared, so-and-so and wife are cleared. Well, let's give her names, so they're all named now. And I thought that was the end of it. But one woman, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., was left out. She's a single woman. She's supposedly slow-witted, according to one of the petitions, saying, hey, let's have a little mercy here. She had petitioned. She had confessed. She had accused others, sort of, because the judges expected her to. Whatever she's saying doesn't sound any different from any of the other Andover people who were at their wits' end at this point. But she survives. She puts in for restitution, and in 1712, actual money was paid to the survivors or to the bereaved families. It wasn't enough. And it didn't bring back Grandma if she was hanged, but it was something, and it didn't happen very often with governments involved in witch trials. But anyway, the fact that she'd been left out was discovered by historian Richard Height, who, since he lives in Rhode Island, couldn't do anything about it with his legislatures. He had formed his contacts in Andover, North Andover, where the woman lived, and a school, a middle school class took it up in the civics, and it took years, and I guess it got several classes worth of students, but it got slowly through the legislature. I got interested in that and was able to ask my legislator to please vote for this, and I was lucky enough to be able to sign up when the judiciary hearing, which was dealing with all of these current cases, but also Elizabeth Johnson Jr., so I had like a short statement I was allowed to make on Zoom, which is pretty spectral if you ask me, but this was just after COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And they passed it very, very easily with the budget of that year. So that was just 2 years ago in 2022. So all of the
It's amazing.
condemned of 1692 have been cleared, I'm glad to say.
Yeah, yeah. That's amazing. And thank you for running through just doing that chronologically for us. Very helpful to hear that and to follow it all the way through to even to 2 years ago, which is amazing to me. Now, I did want to
Sure.
mention something. I know we're getting towards the end of the hour, but I want to let the listeners know that there was a great Smithsonian Channel series called Americans' Hidden Stories, and there was an episode called Salem Secrets, which goes into the Gallows Hill Project. That was a wonderful show. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you would take just a couple minutes and talk to us about the Gallows Hill Project that you were a part of.
Oh, yeah. Well, because the trials are usually in Boston, then for capital cases, there would be a gallows outside Boston gates at the time, and there were hangings on the common. But Salem didn't have a place for that. Where did they do it? It was remembered locally, of course, but it was remembered as being on top of what is called Gallows Hill because of that event. But there was another tradition that it was lower down. It's the same hill, but it's a lower part of it. And the historian Sidney Purley examined the local traditions and the geography, the topography, and came to the conclusion in an article in 1901 that it was on the lower ledges, which were later called Proctor's Ledge, because a later generation of Proctors, descended from the John Proctor who was hanged there, owned that as part of their farm. The top of the hill was what Charles Upham, an early historian of the trials, around the time of the Civil War, he was absolutely certain that's where it was, and most people did. First time I went to Gallows Hill, I climbed up to the top of the hill where the basketball net was, and there's a park up there, and a water tower with a witch on it, a school logo, and it has a great view. So executions were public. It was to give a lesson, but somebody goes up there, they've got a great view, but down below you really can't see what's going on. The lower ledge that Purley found from talking to neighbors, I don't think the neighborhood ever forgot it. That was a more logical place. It was public land then. It was part of a common pasture. It was right near the road to Boston. It was dramatic enough because the river at that time came in that far, so it was a rocky ledge or something. And the hangings would be there within clear sight of anybody on the road. And I imagine they had a pretty good crowd too every time it happened. So that seemed to be the right place. And I found a piece of evidence in the hearing for Rebecca Ames, who was arrested on the day of one of the hangings. And she's being brought in from a town to the north to Salem, and the constables and she reach that site just as the hangings are about to start, and her guards want to see the excitement. So they stash her with the people in the house below the hill, it says vaguely, and they go off to see it. And later in that same day, when she's questioned, the magistrates ask, did you see what happened to the witches? People who claim to be innocent, but we found that they were really witches. Did you see what happened? And she said yes, she could see it from the house below the hill. That's all very vague, but Sidney Purley also did a whole lot of articles on who owned what land as of 1700, which is just after the trials. And there were houses along there, and they had a view of Proctor's Ledge. And I added that bit of information, which the little bits put together with another little bit, which by themselves don't tell you anything, but it might give you a hint. Mm-hmm. It corresponded with all of the other clues that Curley had collected as to what people were looking at. And that, I published a small booklet on that in 1997. So back in the 2000s, 2014, 2012 maybe, a number of us in Salem, associated with Salem, who can't get enough of the minutiae of the trials, got together to discuss, trying to prove that that was the spot. I give credit to Elizabeth Peterson, who was director at the city's owned witch house, which is Judge Collins' house, to assemble us together. Benjamin Ray, Tom Phillips, a filmmaker, Benjamin Ray's a professor, Emerson Baker's a professor, and then me, who can't get enough of the witch trials, and Elizabeth. And Peter Sadlock, who was a professor of geology at Salem State, who did ground-penetrating radar of various spots when we needed that. And also, so much time had gone by that somebody had invented a computer program which would show what the view would have been from any particular spot looking in a particular direction as of whatever time before buildings went up or trees grew up. So the views from where the house below the hill was before it burned down in 1914 pointed towards Proctor's Ledge, not the top of the hill and other views. So the computers proved it one way, the words proved it another. And we took all our findings to the city of Salem and the mayor's office, and they took it. They were happy with that, and they took up the project, hired a landscape architect to put a monument in the spot. The city already owned the spot because back in the 1930s they bought it because it was Proctor's Ledge, and some people believed it was Proctor's Ledge as the spot, which it was. And so it was already town owned. It was just sort of neglected. It was junked, tossed in it, building materials. It was almost sold to a condominium development. That didn't happen because the neighbors knew that it was really the spot. And they built the very nice memorial and dedicated it in 1917 while we were filming that documentary on one of the hottest summits. But it was an experience.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I want to just mention to the listeners, yes, that this was really, that was a great piece that the Smithsonian Channel did. I really enjoyed that. And you just described exactly that information. So anybody wants to watch that, it's right on YouTube. You can find that as well. And I'm going to encourage everybody to hop in to Amazon or somewhere and pick up The Six Women of Salem, a great book by Marilyn, and then also The Salem Witch Trials, which is her other book. Don't miss the chance to read these and get really good information.
Thank you.
So I want to thank Marilyn. Thank you so much for being on the show today. As we start wrapping up here at the end, I just wanted to ask you, is there any other projects or anything else that you're working on? And is there anything people should do to follow your work?
Well, I have a website which I hope to update soon for the next book. I have my fingers crossed. MarilynKRoach.com. You just have to spell it right. Yes, I'm on the last chapter of the companion volume to Six Women of Salem, which was biographical focus on actual individuals that were involved one way or another. I'm doing Six Men of Salem, Because men were accused too,
Mm.
and two of these characters will not
Yeah.
survive the book. But they're not all from Salem, but their lives collide. Captain John Alden, who's accused, Reverend John Hale, who believes what's going on, at least at first, Judge John Hawthorne, who's famous for being involved in the trials, Nathaniel Hawthorne's ancestor, Samuel Wardwell, a carpenter farmer, salt of the earth, but he told fortunes, which was not a good
Wow.
career move at the time. Thomas Putnam, farmer, who suspected everybody, and Reverend George Burroughs, who's accused.
So, Marilyn, when do you think that book will be launched?
Well, we don't have a publisher yet, but it's going to be loosed upon the publishing world once this last chapter gets polished up between me and my agent.
Well, follow Marilyn's webpage and keep an eye for that book, because that's awesome. 6 Men of Salem coming down the pike here in the near future. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Marilyn. I really enjoyed this. Appreciated the time that you've given us here to dive into these subjects and the information in your book. And thank you for walking through that timeline so nicely for us. Is there anything else that you would like to say to
thank you.
Anybody out there?
Oh, don't jump to conclusions when things are going wrong. Make sure what you think might be going on might not be what it is, even if it's possible. And don't accuse your neighbors on spectral evidence alone.
Well, I'll tell you what, that's great advice for today too, because in today's environment, especially politically and everything else, we are seeing a lot of people judging others without information, without all the information. So that's timely advice. We learned it in 1690s, and we can use it today as well. Thank you for sharing that, Marilyn. Well, have a great time. Have a great holiday season. And I hope to run into you and talk to you again in the near future. Thank you, Marilyn, very much. Once again, everybody out there, remember, check out these books. Enjoy it. It's great information for this time of the year. And the last thing I want to remind everybody is to remember there's a lot of strange and unexpected in our reality. So remember to keep your eyes, ears, and minds open. And until next time, stay safe.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.